The water was still warm against my chest as I pulled myself up, my palms pressing against the cool metal of the pool rail. Summer evenings in our neighborhood always carried this particular weight. The air thick with humidity and the fading scent of chlorine, the distant hum of air conditioners working overtime in houses where families were settling into their routines. I had been swimming laps for the better part of an hour, losing myself in the repetitive rhythm of stroke after stroke, the way I always did when my mind needed somewhere safe to go. My arms were burning pleasantly from the exertion, and droplets of water ran down my shoulders as I lifted one leg, then the other, onto the pool deck. The community pool was nearly empty at this hour, just the way I preferred it. A few teenagers had been horsing around earlier, their voices echoing off the water, but they had long since disappeared, leaving behind only the gentle lapping of waves against the tiles and the soft buzz of the underwater lights that had just flickered on. I was reaching for my towel when I felt it. A hand, warm and sure, settling against my waist just above my hip. The contact was so unexpected, so gentle yet deliberate, that for a moment I forgot how to breathe. My body went completely still. The hand wasn't grabbing or pulling. It was simply there, resting against the wet fabric of my swim trunks with a tenderness that made my skin feel electric. Time seemed to suspend itself, the way it does in dreams when you're falling and haven't yet hit the ground. I turned slowly, my heart hammering against my ribs, and found myself looking into the eyes of someone I had noticed before but never really seen. Elias. He stood waist deep in the water, his dark hair slicked back, droplets catching the pool lights like scattered stars. His gaze held mine with an intensity that felt both foreign and achingly familiar, as though he was seeing something in me that I had spent years trying to hide. There was recognition there, not the polite acknowledgement of neighbors who wave from their driveways, but something deeper, more dangerous, something that reached into the carefully constructed spaces of my life and threatened to rearrange everything I thought I knew about myself. I let out a laugh, nervous, too loud, the kind of sound that tries to pretend nothing significant has just happened. But even as I forced the sound from my throat, I could feel something fundamental shifting inside me, like a door I had kept locked for decades was suddenly creaking open. The sensation of his hand lingered on my skin even after he let it fall away, as though his touch had left an invisible mark that would never quite fade. The pool lights beneath the surface cast fractured patterns across both our faces, blue and wavering, making the moment feel dreamlike and surreal. I should have stepped away. I should have mumbled some excuse about getting home to dinner, to homework help, to the 1,000 small responsibilities that filled my evenings. Instead, I stood there dripping, feeling exposed in a way that had nothing to do with the swimsuit or the cooling air against my skin. His eyes never left mine, and I realized with a clarity that was both thrilling and terrifying that this simple touch, this brief, innocent contact between two men at a community pool on an ordinary summer evening, felt like the quiet collapse of a wall I had been holding up for so long that I had forgotten what lay behind it. The water continued its gentle movement around us, oblivious to the fact that my world had just tilted on its axis. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, and a screen door slammed shut, the sounds of a neighborhood settling into nighttime routines. But here, in this chlorinated sanctuary where I had come to escape my thoughts, I found myself confronting a truth I had spent a lifetime trying to outrun. I was 42 years old, and I had just felt more alive in a single moment than I had in years of careful, measured living. That moment at the pool rail should have been an anomaly, a strange blip in an otherwise predictable evening. But as I drove home through the familiar maze of suburban streets, past the identical mailboxes and carefully manicured lawns, I could still feel the phantom pressure of his hand against my waist. My life, I had always believed, was built on solid foundations. Structure, order, the kind of reliability that other people envied. Our house sat at the end of Maple Drive, a colonial with navy blue shutters and a front garden that Vanessa tended with the same meticulous care she brought to everything else. The hedges were trimmed to perfect angles, the walkway swept clean of even the smallest leaves. Inside, Our walls were lined with framed photographs that told the story of a successful family, Lillian's school plays, Owen's Little League victories, vacation snapshots from beach houses and mountain cabins. A life lived in careful increments, each milestone documented and displayed. I had built this world with the same precision I brought to my work as an architect. Every detail considered, every angle measured, every element serving both function and form. At 42, I was the kind of man people described as dependable, safe. When neighbors needed recommendations for contractors or schools, they asked me. When friends planned group vacations, they looked to me for logistics. I was the steady one, the anchor, the person who could be counted on to make sensible decisions. Vanessa was waiting in the kitchen when I walked through the door, her blonde hair pulled back in the loose ponytail she wore when she was focused on something. She looked up from the stack of permission slips she was signing, offering me the smile that had first caught my attention 20 years ago at a coffee shop near the university. Warm, genuine, completely trusting. She asked me how the swim was, and I told her it was fine, good for clearing my head. The lie came so easily that it startled me. She nodded, mentioning that Owen needed help with his math homework and that Lillian had called from her friend's house asking to stay for dinner. Normal things. Ordinary concerns that filled the spaces between our days. Later, after Owen had struggled through long division and we had convinced him that bedtime was not negotiable, I sat in my home office reviewing blueprints for a new office complex downtown. The drafting table was positioned so I could see out the window to our backyard, where the automatic sprinklers had just activated, sending arcs of water across the grass in perfectly timed intervals. Everything in its place, everything functioning as designed. But sitting there in the lamplight, pencil in hand, I found myself thinking about water of a different kind. The way pool lights fractured and danced beneath the surface. The way silence could feel heavy with possibility. The way a simple touch could make you question everything you thought you knew about yourself. I had been swimming at the community pool for 3 years, ever since my doctor suggested I needed more cardiovascular exercise. Twice a week, Tuesday and Thursday evenings, I would drive the 10 minutes from our house and spend an hour moving through the water in measured strokes. Freestyle mostly, occasionally backstroke when my shoulders were tight from hunching over drafting tables. The pool had become my sanctuary, the one place where my mind could go quiet, where the endless mental lists of responsibilities and deadlines would finally stop their constant chatter. The other regulars had become familiar faces over time, but we maintained the polite distance that characterized most interactions in our neighborhood. A nod of acknowledgement, perhaps a comment about the weather or the water temperature, but nothing that ventured into actual connection. I preferred it that way. The pool was about solitude, about the meditative rhythm of stroke after stroke, the way problems seemed to dissolve in the repetitive motion of swimming. At least, it had been about solitude. Until tonight. I set down my pencil and leaned back in my chair, staring at the blueprints without really seeing them. 23 years of marriage. 2 children who looked at me like I had answers to everything. A mortgage, a retirement account, season tickets to the local theater that we used every month without fail. Sunday services at the Methodist church where I sometimes served as an usher, shaking hands with parishioners and helping elderly members find their seats. This was the life I had chosen, the life I had worked methodically to build. And yet, in those quiet moments when I thought no one was watching, I sometimes caught myself staring out windows for too long, or lingering over a glass of bourbon after dinner, or standing under the shower until the hot water ran cold. There was something missing, some essential piece that I had never been able to name or locate. I had always assumed it was restlessness, the kind of midlife questioning that happened to everyone. The desire for adventure, perhaps, or nostalgia for the spontaneity of youth. Normal things that normal people worked through without appending their entire existence. But tonight, driving home with the memory of unexpected touch still burning on my skin, I wondered if what I had been missing was not some external adventure or change of scenery. I wondered if what I had been avoiding was not a place or an experience, but a fundamental truth about who I was underneath all the careful construction. The house settled around me with its familiar creaks and sighs, and somewhere down the hall, Vanessa was already asleep, her breathing deep and even. I sat alone in the circle of light from my desk lamp, surrounded by the evidence of a life lived according to plan, and felt more like a stranger to myself than I had in years. For 3 days after that evening at the pool, I avoided going back. I told myself I was busy with work, that the Henderson project needed my attention, that Owen's soccer practice conflicted with my usual swim time. All perfectly reasonable excuses that felt hollow even as I constructed them. The truth was that I was afraid of what I might find there, or more accurately, afraid of what might find me. But Thursday evening arrived with its familiar weight of routine, and I found myself driving toward the community center despite every rational voice in my head suggesting I take a different route home. The parking lot was nearly empty, just a few cars scattered across the asphalt under the yellow glow of streetlights that had recently flickered on. He was there when I walked through the gate to the pool area, and the sight of him made something in my chest tighten. Elias sat on one of the plastic chairs near the shallow end, a towel draped around his shoulders, reading what looked like a paperback novel. He glanced up when he heard my footsteps on the concrete, and that same recognition passed between us, immediate and undeniable. I had seen him before, I realized now. Brief glimpses over the past few weeks, always at the periphery of my awareness. A figure moving through the water with an easy stroke, or sitting quietly on the pool deck while I focused on my laps. But I had never really looked, had never allowed myself to notice the way he carried himself, relaxed and unguarded in a way that seemed foreign to me. The conversation started simply enough, the kind of polite exchange that happens in shared spaces. He mentioned that the water felt perfect tonight, and I agreed, setting my towel on a nearby chair. His voice had a quiet quality to it, thoughtful, as though he considered his words before speaking them. When I asked if he was new to the area, he smiled in a way that suggested the question was more complicated than it appeared. He told me he had grown up here, had spent his childhood summers at this very pool, but had been away for nearly 15 years. Los Angeles first, then Portland, following work and relationships and the kind of opportunities that led people away from small towns. He was a writer, he said, mostly freelance journalism and the occasional magazine piece, work that allowed him to live untethered to any particular place. I found myself asking questions I wouldn't normally ask, drawn by something in his manner that invited confession. He had recently returned to help settle his mother's estate, he explained, and had decided to stay for a while, renting a small apartment near downtown, taking time to figure out what came next. There was something appealing about the lack of certainty in his life, the way he seemed comfortable with questions that had no immediate answers. As we talked, I noticed details that I had trained myself not to notice about other men. The way his dark hair curled slightly when it was wet. The careful attention he paid when I spoke, as though my words carried weight. The fact that his wedding finger was bare, unmarked by the pale band that circled my own. Our conversations became a regular part of my swimming routine. He was there most evenings when I arrived, sometimes in the water, but more often sitting on the edge, his feet dangling in the shallow end, watching. I began to realize that he was waiting, though neither of us acknowledged what he might be waiting for. We talked about work, about the town and how it had changed, about books and movies and the kinds of safe topics that fill the space between strangers becoming something else. But underneath the ordinary exchange of information, there was a current I had never felt before, a sense that we were having two conversations simultaneously, the one with words, and another one conducted entirely through glances and silences, and the way he sometimes let his sentences trail off, as though he was leaving space for me to fill in what couldn't be said aloud. 3 weeks into this new routine, I was gathering my things to leave when he stood up from where he had been sitting and moved closer. He didn't say anything, just positioned himself near the pool ladder where I was reaching for my car keys. The gesture seemed casual enough, but when I straightened up, he was close enough that I could smell the chlorine on his skin and see the way the overhead lights reflected in his eyes. Then his hand was at my waist again, but this time there was no pretense of accident or necessity. His palm pressed against my side with unmistakable intention, fingers splaying slightly against the fabric of my shirt. He was testing something, I realized, some invisible boundary that had been building between us through weeks of careful conversation and loaded silences. I should have stepped away, should have reminded him that I was married, that I had children waiting at home, that this was not who I was or who I could afford to become. Instead, I stood perfectly still, my heart hammering so loudly I was certain he could hear it, and allowed myself to feel the warmth of his touch spreading through my entire body like fever. The moment stretched between us, fragile and electric, until the sound of voices from the parking lot broke the spell. His hand fell away, and we stood there looking at each other with something that felt like shared guilt and shared hunger, and the terrifying recognition that we had just crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. I drove home through streets that seemed different somehow, as though the familiar landmarks had been rearranged while I wasn't paying attention. Vanessa was in the kitchen when I arrived, stirring something on the stove while simultaneously helping Lillian with a science project about planetary orbits. She looked up when I walked in, mentioning that Owen needed new cleats for soccer season and asking if I thought we should paint the guest bedroom before her mother's visit in October. I responded appropriately, made the right sounds of agreement and concern, but her voice seemed to be coming from very far away. All I could think about was the weight of Elias's hand against my waist, the way it had felt both forbidden and inevitable, like something I had been waiting for my entire life without knowing it. Later, lying in bed beside my wife while she read through her book club selection, I stared at the ceiling and admitted to myself the truth that had been building in my chest like pressure in a diving bell. When Elias had touched me, when his hand had settled against my side with such careful deliberation, I had not wanted him to let go. I had wanted him to hold on, to pull me closer, to acknowledge aloud what we both seemed to understand but could not yet name. The recognition was terrifying not because it was foreign, but because it felt like coming home. The transformation began so gradually that I almost convinced myself it wasn't happening at all. What started as polite conversation at the pool's edge slowly extended beyond the chain-link fence that surrounded the community center. First, it was coffee after a particularly long swim session, when Elias mentioned a new place downtown that served decent espresso. I told myself I was simply being neighborly, that it would have been rude to decline such a casual invitation. The cafe was small and dimly lit, the kind of place where local artists displayed their work on exposed brick walls, and the baristas knew most customers by name. We sat near the window, watching the evening foot traffic drift past on the sidewalk outside. Elias ordered his coffee black. I asked for cream and sugar, and we fell into conversation with an ease that surprised me. He asked about my work, about the specific challenges of designing buildings that would outlast the people who commissioned them. I found myself talking about architecture in a way I hadn't in years, describing the satisfaction of solving complex spatial problems, the way a well-designed space could influence how people moved through their daily lives. He listened with genuine interest, asking follow-up questions that demonstrated he was actually absorbing what I was telling him. But then he shifted the conversation in a direction that made my chest tighten with something between anticipation and alarm. He asked me about my family, about what it was like to be married, to have children, to build a life around other people's needs and expectations. The questions weren't intrusive exactly, but they carried a weight that suggested he was looking for something specific in my responses. "Do you ever feel like you built a life before you even knew who you were?" he asked one evening as we walked slowly around the neighborhood near the pool. The question hung in the air between us like smoke, impossible to ignore but dangerous to inhale too deeply. I told him I thought everyone felt that way sometimes, that adulthood was essentially a series of decisions made with incomplete information. But even as I said it, I knew he was asking about something more fundamental than career choices or mortgage payments. These conversations outside the pool became a regular occurrence, though I was careful never to acknowledge them as intentional meetings. Coffee turned into walks around the downtown area. Walks became longer conversations on park benches or in the small plaza near the library. I told Vanessa I was exploring photography again, taking evening walks to capture the way light fell across different architectural details. Another lie that came surprisingly easily, another small crack in the foundation of my carefully honest life. Elias had a way of asking questions that cracked open pieces of myself I had sealed away years ago. He wanted to know about my dreams when I was younger, about the person I had imagined I would become before responsibility and expectations began shaping my choices. He told me about his own journey, the years of moving from place to place, following instincts rather than plans, learning to trust uncertainty rather than fighting it. There was something magnetic about his approach to life, the way he seemed comfortable with questions that had no clear answers. He talked about writing as an act of discovery, about sitting down at his laptop each morning without knowing what would emerge on the page. He described relationships that had ended not because of betrayal or anger, but simply because people had grown in different directions and had the courage to acknowledge it. I began having dreams about water that were unlike anything I had experienced before. In these dreams, I was simultaneously drowning and surfacing, pulled down by currents I couldn't see, while simultaneously being lifted toward light that broke and danced on the surface above me. I would wake with my heart racing, the sheets damp with sweat, Vanessa sleeping peacefully beside me while I stared at the ceiling, trying to decode what my subconscious was attempting to tell me. The dreams made me feel exposed, as though my sleeping mind was betraying secrets that my waking self had worked hard to conceal. During the day, I found myself thinking about them at inappropriate moments, during client meetings, or while helping Owen with homework, sudden flashes of sensation that made me lose track of conversations mid-sentence. I tried to suppress whatever was happening to me by adding structure to my days, filling every available moment with tasks and responsibilities that would leave no space for dangerous thoughts. I volunteered to coach Lillian's debate team, took on additional projects at work that required evening hours, insisted that we eat dinner together as a family every night without exception. I scheduled weekend activities that would keep us busy from morning until evening, trips to museums and hiking trails and farmers markets that required my full attention and participation. But the harder I worked to reinforce the walls of my ordinary life, the more I noticed the way Elias's laughter seemed to soften the edges of everything around me. The way silence between us felt heavier and more meaningful than most conversations I had with other people. The way I caught myself looking forward to Tuesday and Thursday evenings with an intensity that felt both thrilling and terrifying. Vanessa began commenting on my increased energy, praising my renewed commitment to family activities and community involvement. She seemed pleased that I was taking more interest in the children's school events, that I was volunteering for church committees I had previously avoided. If she noticed that my enthusiasm felt forced, that I was trying too hard to be present, she didn't mention it. But I noticed. I noticed that I was performing the role of devoted husband and father with a self-consciousness that had never been there before, as though I was watching myself from the outside and constantly adjusting my behavior to match some idealized version of who I was supposed to be. The awareness was exhausting, like carrying on a conversation in a foreign language where every sentence required careful translation. 3 months into this new routine of coffee and walks and conversations that circled around truths neither of us was quite ready to speak aloud, Elias suggested we sit by the pool after the official closing time. The community center shut down at 9, but the pool area remained accessible through a gate that was supposed to be locked, but never quite latched properly. It was the kind of minor rule-breaking that would have made me uncomfortable under normal circumstances, but nothing about my relationship with Elias qualified as normal. We sat on the edge of the pool with our feet in the water, the underwater lights casting blue patterns across our faces. The air was warm and still, heavy with the scent of chlorine and the honeysuckle that grew along the fence line. Other than the gentle movement of water around our ankles and the distant hum of traffic from the main road, the world felt completely quiet. Elias was talking about a piece he was writing about small towns and the way people either escaped them or surrendered to them, but I was only half listening. I was focused on the way the light played across his profile, the careful attention he paid to choosing his words, the fact that being near him made me feel more awake and more alive than I had felt in years. When he reached over and brushed his hand against mine, resting on the warm concrete between us. It felt like the most natural thing in the world. Not accidental this time, not testing boundaries, but simply an acknowledgement of something that had been building between us for months. His fingers grazed across my knuckles, light as breath, and I felt that same electric recognition I had experienced the first night he touched my waist. This time, I didn't pull away. I didn't laugh nervously or make excuses about getting home. Instead, I let my hand turn palm upward, and when his fingers found mine, I closed my eyes and tried to memorize the sensation of connection that felt both completely new and achingly familiar. The water rippled gently around our feet, catching fragments of light that danced and disappeared and reformed in patterns that seemed too beautiful to be accidental. We sat like that for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, our hands barely touching, the weight of unspoken understanding settling between us like a blanket neither of us was quite ready to pull away. When I finally drove home that night, I felt as though I was returning from a foreign country where I had briefly learned to speak a language I had forgotten I once knew. The evening it happened was unremarkable in every way except the one that mattered most. I had finished my usual 40 laps, my shoulders burning pleasantly from the exertion, and Elias had been reading in his customary chair near the shallow end. The pool was empty except for us, the summer air thick with humidity that seemed to press against our skin like a living thing. As I pulled myself up the ladder, water streaming from my body, Elias closed his book and stood up, moving toward the pool's edge where I was reaching for my towel. We had done this dance dozens of times now. The careful choreography of two people who were always finding excuses to be near each other while maintaining the pretense that our proximity was accidental. But tonight felt different. There was something in the air between us, a tension that had been building for months finally reaching some invisible breaking point. We walked toward the gate together, our footsteps echoing off the wet concrete, neither of us speaking. The silence wasn't uncomfortable exactly, but it carried weight, as though words had become inadequate for whatever was happening between us. I was fumbling with my car keys, trying to buy time before I had to drive away and return to the life that was waiting for me at home, when Elias stopped walking. I turned to see what had caught his attention and found him standing just close enough that I could see the way the overhead lights reflected in his dark eyes. He took a step closer, and then another, until we were standing face to face with barely inches between us. I opened my mouth to say something, anything that might break the spell that seemed to be weaving itself around us. But before I could form words, his hand was at my cheek, fingers gentle against my skin. The kiss happened so slowly that I had time to understand what was coming and still felt completely unprepared for the reality of it. His lips touched mine with a tenderness that made my knees weak, tentative at first, as though he was giving me one last chance to pull away. When I didn't, when I let my eyes fall closed and allowed myself to sink into the sensation, the kiss deepened into something desperate and trembling and utterly inevitable. It lasted only seconds, but in those seconds I felt as though an entire lifetime was being compressed into a single breath. Every careful wall I had built around my heart seemed to crumble at once, leaving me exposed and raw and more alive than I had ever been. This was what I had been missing, I realized with devastating clarity. This connection, this electricity, this sense of finally coming home to myself. When we broke apart, I staggered backward as though I had been physically struck. My voice, when I finally managed to speak, came out broken and barely recognizable as my own. "I can't," I whispered, the words scraping against my throat like sandpaper. "I have a family. I have responsibilities. This isn't who I am." But even as I said it, even as I spoke the words that were supposed to restore sanity to the situation, my body was screaming at the absence of his touch. Every cell seemed to be reaching toward him, begging me to close the distance I had just created. The rational part of my mind was cataloging all the reasons why this moment was impossible, catastrophic, unthinkable. The rest of me was mourning the loss of connection like a physical amputation. Elias didn't try to argue with me or convince me that my obligations were less important than they seemed. He simply nodded, his own face pale in the fluorescent light, and told me he understood. That he was sorry if he had misread the situation. That he would see me around. I drove home through streets that looked exactly the same as they always had, but felt completely foreign, as though the kiss had transported me to some parallel version of my life, where everything appeared normal on the surface, but operated according to entirely different laws. My hands shook on the steering wheel, and I had to pull over twice to catch my breath and convince myself that I was capable of walking into my house and pretending that nothing fundamental had shifted in the universe. Vanessa was in the living room when I arrived, curled up on the couch with her laptop, working on lesson plans for the elementary school where she taught third grade. She looked up when I came through the door, smiling the same warm, trusting smile she had been giving me for 23 years, and asked how the swim was. Fine, I told her, the lie burning my throat as I spoke it. Good for clearing my head. She nodded and went back to her work, completely unaware that her husband was standing in their living room, feeling like an intruder in his own life. I watched her for a moment, taking in the familiar curve of her neck as she bent over the computer screen, the way her hair fell across her shoulder, the comfortable ease with which she inhabited the space we had built together. She was beautiful and kind and deserving of a man who could love her with his whole heart, and the recognition that I might not be that man hit me like a physical blow. I went upstairs and stood in the shower until the hot water ran cold, letting the spray wash away the chlorine and the lingering scent of Elias's skin while I tried to process what had just happened to me. When I finally emerged and looked at myself in the bathroom mirror, I barely recognized the man staring back. My eyes looked different somehow, wider and more vulnerable, as though the kiss had stripped away some essential disguise I had been wearing for decades. Later, lying in bed next to Vanessa while she read through her book club selection, I stared at the ceiling and tried to convince myself that what I had felt in Elias's arms was an aberration, a moment of weakness that could be forgotten and filed away with other mistakes I had made and learned from. But my body wouldn't cooperate with the lie. Every nerve ending still hummed with the memory of his touch, and when I closed my eyes, I could still taste him on my lips. The revelation wasn't just the kiss itself, though that had been earth-shattering enough. The revelation was the recognition that what I had felt in those few seconds of connection was more real, more honest, more fundamentally true than all the years of careful performance that had come before it. For 23 years, I had been playing the role of devoted husband and father, and I had played it well enough to convince everyone, including myself. But tonight, with Elias's hands in my hair and his breath against my skin, I had felt like myself for the first time in my adult life. Not the version of myself that had been shaped by expectations and obligations and the need to be seen as reliable and safe, but the person I might have been if I had possessed the courage to listen to my own heart instead of the voices that told me who I was supposed to become. Vanessa's breathing deepened into sleep beside me, and I lay there in the darkness knowing with terrible certainty that I could never go back to unknowing what I now knew. The kiss had been a door opening onto a landscape I had spent my entire life trying not to see, and now that I had glimpsed what lay beyond it, pretending blindness was no longer an option. I was 42 years old, and I had just discovered that the life I thought I was living had been a carefully constructed fiction. The question now was what I was going to do with that knowledge. The days after the kiss unraveled like a ball of yarn dropped down a staircase, each hour pulling me further from any semblance of the man I had been. I stopped going to the pool entirely, driving past the community center on Tuesday and Thursday evenings with my swim bag in the back seat, telling myself I would stop next time, that I just needed one more day to figure out how to face him again. But next time never came. Instead, I found myself taking longer routes home from work, circling through neighborhoods I didn't know, sitting in parking lots of businesses that held no interest for me, anything to delay the moment when I would have to walk through my front door and pretend to be the husband and father my family expected to see. The pretending became excruciating. Every conversation felt like a performance I was giving from behind thick glass, present but fundamentally disconnected from the words coming out of my mouth. When Lillian told me about her upcoming debate tournament, I heard myself responding with appropriate enthusiasm and pride, but the emotions felt borrowed from some previous version of myself. When Owen asked for help building a model airplane, I sat beside him at the kitchen table, passing him pieces and offering guidance, but my hands moved as though they belonged to someone else. Vanessa noticed first that I was lingering by windows, staring out at nothing in particular for minutes at a time. Then she mentioned that I seemed distracted during dinner conversations, that she sometimes had to repeat herself when she asked me questions about my day. I assured her it was work stress, a particularly challenging project that required more mental energy than usual. The lie came easily, but it sat heavy in my chest like a stone I couldn't swallow. The late nights started innocently enough. I would tell her I had emails to catch up on, blueprints to review, client calls to return. All plausible excuses that aligned with my reputation as someone who took his professional responsibilities seriously. But the truth was that I couldn't bear to lie beside her in the dark, knowing that if she turned toward me in her sleep, if she reached for me the way she sometimes did in the early morning hours, I would have to respond as though nothing fundamental had changed between us. Instead, I sat in my home office until well past midnight, staring at architectural drawings without seeing them, or wandering through the house like a ghost haunting his own life. I memorized the creaks and sighs of our home in the deepest hours of night, when the refrigerator hummed, and the central air clicked on and off, and everyone I loved most in the world slept peacefully, unaware that their anchor had come loose from its moorings. 3 weeks into this new routine of avoidance and sleeplessness, Vanessa found me standing at the kitchen window at 2 in the morning, still fully dressed, watching the automatic sprinklers water our lawn in perfect timed intervals. She appeared beside me in her robe, her hair mussed from sleep, and asked gently if I was feeling all right. I told her I was fine, just restless, but something in my voice must have betrayed me because she didn't return to bed. Instead, she made tea for both of us and sat beside me at the kitchen table, waiting. We had been married long enough for her to recognize when my silences meant something more than fatigue or work pressure. The question, when it finally came, was delivered with the same gentle directness she brought to difficult conversations with her students. "Julian," she said, setting down her mug and looking at me with eyes that held both love and growing concern, "is there someone else?" The words hung in the air between us like smoke, impossible to pretend I hadn't heard them. I opened my mouth to deny it, to reassure her that her fears were unfounded, that whatever distance she was sensing had nothing to do with another person. But the lie wouldn't come. After weeks of performing devotion I no longer felt, of pretending an enthusiasm for our shared life that had drained away like water from a broken vessel, I discovered I no longer had the energy to maintain the fiction. "Yes," I said quietly, the word falling between us like a stone dropped into still water. "There is." Her face didn't crumble the way faces do in movies when marriages implode. Instead, something behind her eyes simply went out, like a candle being snuffed by a sudden breeze. She nodded slowly, as though my confession had confirmed something she had already known but hadn't wanted to believe, and asked if I loved this other person. The question was so quietly devastating that I almost couldn't answer it. Not because the answer was complicated, but because it was so simple and so completely destructive to everything we had built together. "I do," I whispered, and watched 23 years of trust and partnership and shared dreams fracture like glass. She didn't ask for details, didn't demand to know who or when or how long. Instead, she asked the one question that cut deeper than all of those. "Have you been pretending with me? Have you been pretending to be happy here?" The honesty that poured out of me then felt like bleeding. I told her about the years of feeling like I was living someone else's life, of waking up each morning and putting on the persona of devoted husband and father like a costume that never quite fit properly. I told her about the growing sense that I had built our life together before I understood who I really was, that I had married her not out of passionate love, but out of the desire to become the kind of man I thought I was supposed to be. I told her, with a voice that cracked like ice under pressure, that I had spent our entire marriage hiding from myself, and that I was tired of pretending to be someone I wasn't. The words came out in a rush, as though a dam had finally burst, And with each confession, I felt simultaneously more honest and more monstrous. Vanessa listened without interrupting, her hands wrapped around her tea mug as though it was the only solid thing in a world that had suddenly become liquid. When I finally ran out of words, she was quiet for so long I wondered if she was ever going to speak again. When she finally did, her voice was steady but hollow, like an echo of herself. "I think I've always known," she said. "Not about someone else, but about the pretending. I just didn't want to see it." She stood up from the table then, rinsed her mug in the sink with careful precision, and told me she needed time to think. That she couldn't sleep in the same bed with me tonight, maybe not for many nights to come. That we would have to figure out how to tell the children, how to protect them from the worst of this devastation. But that conversation would have to wait until she could think clearly again. After she disappeared upstairs, I sat alone in the dark kitchen with only the hum of the refrigerator for company, staring at my reflection in the window. The man looking back at me was a stranger, hollow-eyed and exhausted, but for the first time in years, completely honest. I had destroyed my marriage and shattered my family's sense of security, but I had finally stopped lying to the person I loved most about who I really was. The relief was almost as devastating as the guilt. 2 weeks after that conversation in the kitchen, I found myself driving toward the community center without having made a conscious decision to do so. My hands turned the steering wheel through familiar intersections while my mind remained somewhere else entirely, caught between the wreckage of what had been and the uncertainty of what might come next. Vanessa had moved into the guest bedroom the morning after our conversation, and we had begun the careful choreography of two people learning to exist in the same space, while everything they had built together slowly came apart. We spoke to each other with the polite distance of strangers, coordinating schedules and household logistics with efficiency that masked the devastation underneath. The children sensed something had shifted, though we hadn't yet found the words to explain what was happening to our family. Lillian asked why I was sleeping on the couch, and I told her I had been having trouble with my back. Owen wondered why his mother looked so tired, why dinner conversations had become stilted affairs where everyone focused too intently on their food. We assured them that everything was fine, that sometimes adults went through difficult periods that had nothing to do with them, but I could see the worry growing in their eyes. The pool was nearly empty when I arrived, just an elderly man swimming slow laps in the far lane and a woman sitting on the edge with her feet in the water, reading. The familiar scent of chlorine and the soft echo of water against tiles felt like returning to a place I had been homesick for without realizing it. I changed into my suit mechanically, my body remembering the routine, even as my mind struggled to understand why I had come back here. The water was exactly the temperature I expected, warm enough to be comfortable, but cool enough to feel refreshing against skin that had been carrying too much heat for weeks. I swam 10 laps, then 20, then lost count entirely as my body fell back into the rhythm that had once provided such reliable escape. But tonight, the repetitive motion of stroke after stroke brought no peace. Instead, it seemed to amplify the awareness that I was here alone, that the person whose presence had transformed this ordinary space into something electric and dangerous was nowhere to be seen. When I finally pulled myself up the ladder, water streaming from my hair and shoulders, the pool deck felt vast and empty in a way it never had before. I sat on the edge where Elias and I had once dangled our feet, where his hand had brushed against mine with such careful intention, and stared at the underwater lights that cast their familiar blue patterns across the bottom. My wedding ring caught the fluorescent light as I lifted my hand to push the wet hair back from my forehead. 23 years of marriage contained in a simple band of gold that had become so much a part of me, I barely noticed its presence anymore. But tonight, I found myself staring at it with the same recognition I had felt that first evening when Elias touched my waist. The sudden awareness that something I had taken for granted was actually a choice I made every day. I slipped the ring off slowly, feeling the unfamiliar absence of its weight against my skin. It sat warm in my palm, this small circle of metal that represented vows I had made with sincere intention to a woman I genuinely cared for. promises spoken by a man who had believed he understood what love was supposed to feel like. The ring had fit perfectly when Vanessa slipped it onto my finger on our wedding day. Both of us young and certain that commitment and compatibility were sufficient foundation for a lifetime together. I had worn it through every season of our marriage, through the births of our children and the purchase of our house and countless ordinary moments that had seemed, at the time, like the building blocks of contentment. But sitting by the pool with chlorinated water dripping from my skin and the echo of honest conversation still ringing in my ears, I understood that I had been carrying this symbol of love I had never fully felt, wearing this promise I had made before I understood what I was promising to give up. I set the ring on the tiles beside me, where it clinked softly against the concrete and caught fragments of light from the underwater illumination. For the first time in months, I took a deep breath that reached all the way to the bottom of my lungs, air that didn't seem to catch on the weight I had been carrying in my chest. The sound of my exhale seemed to echo off the water, and I realized I was crying, not the desperate sobbing that had accompanied the destruction of my marriage, but quiet tears that felt more like relief than grief. I was grieving, certainly, for the family I had fractured and the security I had destroyed and the man I had been before I understood the difference between the life I had built and the life I actually wanted. But underneath the sorrow was something that felt like freedom, the recognition that I was finally sitting by this pool as myself rather than as a performance of someone I thought I was supposed to be. The truth had been catastrophic and painful and had hurt people I loved, but it had also been the first honest thing I had done in decades. I stayed until the pool lights shut off automatically and the facility closed around me, sitting in the darkness with my feet in the water and my wedding ring beside me on the tiles. When I finally stood to leave, I picked up the ring and slipped it into the pocket of my towel, not forgotten, but no longer worn. The drive home took me through the same suburban streets I had traveled thousands of times before, past the identical mailboxes and carefully maintained lawns, through the geography of a life I was still living but no longer pretending to recognize as my own. Tomorrow would bring difficult conversations with lawyers and children, logistics of separation, and the careful dismantling of shared dreams. But tonight, for the first time in as long as I could remember, I was simply driving home as myself.